The afternoon had started the way dozens of others had that summer. Eastern Kentucky, July of 1986, the kind of heat that settled into the hollows and stayed there, heavy but familiar. Cicadas droned in the trees, and the sky carried that pale blue haze that meant no storms were coming. It was an ordinary day, and that ordinariness mattered, because nothing about it suggested it would be remembered for the rest of the county's history. The three sisters had grown up on that land, or close enough to it, that the mountains felt like part of the family. Their last name carried weight in the area. Not power, not money, just recognition. They were known. Their parents were known. People waved when they passed. In a place like this, familiarity was a kind of safety. The oldest sister was 26. She had always been the responsible one, the steady presence who made lists and reminded everyone what time it was. She worked weekdays, saved her money, and talked about leaving someday, though no one was sure she ever would. The middle sister, 23, was quieter, more inward. She liked books, liked walking trails alone, liked the feeling of being somewhere untouched. The youngest was 19, restless and energetic, still figuring out who she was, still close enough to childhood that her laughter carried farther than she realized. They lived at home, at least for now. That morning, the idea of a picnic hadn't felt planned so much as inevitable. The heat was oppressive indoors, the mountains were calling, and the recreation area was close enough that it barely counted as a trip. Just a few hours. A blanket, some food, a short hike. Back before dark. Their mother watched them gather things in the kitchen. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a jug of iced tea, a small cooler. It wasn't an event, just a pause in routine. She asked, casually, what time they thought they'd be back. The oldest sister said before sunset. Maybe earlier. There was no argument, no warning, no hesitation. They'd done this before. They left in the early afternoon, driving a car that was as familiar to the family as the front porch. The road out toward the mountains was narrow and winding, bordered by trees and occasional clearings, where old houses leaned toward the earth. The recreation area sat tucked into a stretch of Appalachian forest that locals treated as both refuge and background. It was there, it always had been there, and most people didn't think much about it. The sisters parked at a trailhead used mostly by hikers and hunters. The car would later be described as neatly placed, aligned between the faded lines, nothing careless about it. When it was found, the doors were unlocked. Inside, the cooler was still there. So were the sandwiches. Nothing appeared rummaged through. Nothing was missing. No broken glass. No footprints that stood out. It looked like a car left by people who expected to come back. No one knows exactly where the sisters walked after. They locked, or didn't lock, the doors. There were several trails branching out from the lot, some maintained, some barely more than paths pressed into the dirt by years of boots. They knew the area well enough to wander without fear. That familiarity would later complicate everything. By early evening, the light shifted. Shadows lengthened in the woods, and the air cooled just slightly. At home, dinner came and went. The sun dipped lower. Their mother watched the road more than once, expecting headlights to appear. When they didn't, she told herself not to worry. The girls had always been independent. Maybe they stopped somewhere. Maybe they lost track of time. By the time the sun set fully, unease crept in quietly. Not panic, just a tightening in the chest. She picked up the phone and called a few relatives. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. By 9 o'clock, the worry had become sharp enough to act on. Local law enforcement was contacted. In 1986, in rural Kentucky, that meant a small sheriff's department with limited manpower and a wide jurisdiction. The initial response was measured. Adults were missing, but adults sometimes chose to stay out late. There was no sign yet that anything criminal had occurred. Still, a deputy drove out toward the recreation area. The car was found that night, sitting alone at the trailhead. Headlights off, windows up, exactly where it should have been. The deputy noted the time, the condition of the vehicle, the contents inside. It didn't look abandoned. It looked paused. By then, darkness had settled fully into the forest. The terrain beyond the trailhead was unforgiving, even in daylight. Steep inclines, dense underbrush, drop-offs hidden by foliage. Organizing a full search in the dark wasn't realistic. The deputy walked a short distance down the nearest trail with a flashlight, calling out their names, listening for a response that never came. The woods answered back only with insects and the soft movement of leaves. Search and rescue was contacted, but assembling volunteers and equipment took time. There were also limits. Night searches carried their own risks, and without a known direction or location, every step deeper into the forest multiplied the danger. The decision was made to secure the area and resume in the morning. That night passed slowly for the family. Sleep didn't come. The house felt wrong without the sisters inside it, too quiet in a way that pressed against the walls. Every sound outside triggered a glance toward the door. Every hour that passed felt heavier than the last. At first light, the search began in earnest. Deputies, firefighters, and volunteers gathered near the trailhead. Some brought dogs, others brought maps and radios. The sisters' parents stood nearby, watching strangers disappear into the trees, holding on to the belief that this was a misunderstanding, that their daughters would be found cold, tired, embarrassed, but alive. The early hours were filled with movement and cautious optimism. Trails were walked, names were called. Dogs worked the ground near the car, circling, pausing, then losing interest. The scent didn't lead anywhere definitive. It seemed to scatter, as though the sisters had moved in multiple directions or left the area entirely. By mid-morning, the sun was higher, and the reality of the terrain became clear. The forest was vast. The recreation area connected to miles of unmanaged land. There were ravines deep enough to swallow sound, old paths that led nowhere, places where a person could fall and never be seen from above. Still, there were no signs, no dropped items, no scraps of clothing, no disturbed earth. The picnic supplies in the car became harder to explain with every hour. If the sisters had intended to stay longer, why leave the food behind? If they'd planned a hike, why bring it at all? Law enforcement treated it as a missing persons case, not a crime. That distinction mattered. It shaped the tone of the investigation. There was no tape, no crime scene perimeter, no forensic sweep of the car beyond basic documentation. The assumption, early on, was that something accidental had happened. A wrong turn, an injury, disorientation. As the day wore on, hope thinned, not disappeared, but stretched. The family watched searchers return to the trailhead empty-handed, faces drawn, voices quieter than before. Each update carried less certainty. By late afternoon, clouds gathered over the ridges, and the air shifted again. There was talk of weather moving in, of the search needing to pause if conditions worsened. The idea that the sisters might be out there as night approached for a second time settled heavily over everyone involved. No one said it out loud, but the unspoken question hung in the air. If they were alive, why hadn't they made contact? Why hadn't they been found yet? As daylight began to fade again, the search scaled back. Teams returned. Plans were made to continue the next morning. The family went home once more to a house that felt increasingly unfamiliar, carrying the weight of a silence that had now lasted nearly 24 hours. Somewhere beyond the trailhead, the mountains remained unchanged. The forest gave no answers. And as the second night closed in, the certainty that this was no longer a simple delay began to settle in, quiet and irreversible, pulling the case and everyone attached to it, into something far darker than anyone had imagined when the sisters packed their picnic that morning. The morning after the disappearance did not bring clarity. It brought scale. What began as a small, focused search around a trailhead expanded outward, stretching into ridges and valleys that even lifelong locals admitted they rarely entered. Word traveled fast through the county. By the second day, volunteers arrived in pickup trucks and old sedans, some still in work clothes, others carrying walking sticks, rope, or nothing at all except the need to help. State police joined the effort, followed by firefighters trained in search and rescue. Maps were spread across hoods of vehicles. Areas were divided into grids. Teams were assigned sections of land that looked manageable on paper, but felt endless once entered. The Appalachian terrain did not reveal itself easily. Trails faded without warning. Ground sloped sharply, then dropped away. Thick brush grabbed at clothing and slowed every step. Search dogs were brought in early. They circled the sisters' car, noses to the ground, handlers watching for any sign of direction. The dogs worked hard, then faltered. A scent trail seemed to form briefly, then vanished. It was as if the ground itself refused to hold on to whatever trace the sisters had left behind. Helicopters flew low passes over the forest, scanning for movement, disturbed vegetation, anything that looked out of place. From above, the trees formed a continuous canopy, broken only by rock and shadow. Nothing stood out. Nothing waved back. Each day followed a similar pattern. Early optimism gave way to exhaustion by afternoon. Searchers returned scratched, soaked in sweat, shaking their heads. They reported what they didn't find, far more often than what they did. And when something did surface, it never lasted long under examination. A shoe print near a creek that didn't match the sisters' footwear. A scrap of fabric that turned out to be decades old. A cooler sighting reported by a hiker that, when traced, belonged to someone else entirely. Every potential break came with a rush of adrenaline, followed by the quiet collapse of disappointment. Sightings were reported almost immediately. A woman at a gas station swore she'd seen 3 girls matching their description late the night they vanished. A hunter claimed he heard voices calling in the distance the following morning. Each tip was logged, followed up, and slowly stripped of certainty. Times didn't line up. Descriptions shifted. Memories blurred under pressure. The family lived inside that cycle of hope and loss. Every phone call felt like it might change everything. Every update carried the weight of expectation. They asked questions that law enforcement couldn't answer. Why not search farther? Why not bring in more dogs? Why wasn't foul play being considered more seriously? Those questions created quiet tension. Not arguments, not confrontations, but a strain that grew heavier as days turned into weeks. Investigators were working within protocols, within resources, within the assumptions that guided missing persons cases at the time. The family was working within fear, within grief, within the instinct that something was terribly wrong. Rumors began to circulate, as they often do when answers are slow. Some people talked about wildlife, about black bears or feral dogs. Others mentioned old mine shafts scattered through the area, some unmarked, some forgotten entirely. A fall into one of those would explain everything and nothing at the same time. There were darker whispers, too. Suggestions that the sisters might have encountered someone on the trail, a stranger, or not a stranger at all. Eastern Kentucky in the 1980s was not untouched by violence, but it was a place where people preferred explanations that didn't involve intentional harm. The idea that someone could disappear 3 women without a trace was difficult to accept. As the search widened, it also thinned. Volunteers couldn't keep taking time off work. The same sections of land were walked again and again, producing the same silence. Dogs were rotated out. Helicopter time was limited. Each additional day without evidence made the next day harder to justify. The sisters' belongings remained frozen in time inside the car. The food went untouched. The cooler stayed closed. Investigators documented it carefully, but there was nothing to analyze, nothing to test. It wasn't a crime scene in the traditional sense. It was a question mark parked at the edge of the forest. By the end of the first week, the tone shifted. Search briefings grew shorter. Words like recovery began to replace words like rescue, though rarely in front of the family. No one wanted to say it plainly, but the chances of finding the sisters alive were slipping away hour by hour. Local newspapers ran stories that balanced fact with speculation. Radio stations repeated descriptions and phone numbers. For a time, it felt as though the entire region was holding its breath. But breath can only be held so long. The family returned to the trailhead more than once, standing near the car, staring into the trees, trying to imagine which direction the sisters might have taken. Every path looked possible. Every path led to the same uncertainty. As summer wore on, heat storms rolled through the area, altering the landscape. Rain washed away potential evidence. Streams swelled and shifted. Whatever faint traces might have existed in those early days were gone now, absorbed by the ground. Investigators revisited earlier leads, hoping something had been missed. They interviewed people again. They checked alibis that didn't feel solid, but couldn't be disproven. Each pass through the evidence led back to the same conclusion. There was nothing concrete to hold on to. By late summer, the official search was scaled back. Not stopped, but reduced to periodic checks and follow-ups. The case remained open, technically active, but the urgency that defined the first weeks had drained away. The mountain did not give anything back. No remains, no belongings, no explanation. In town, the sisters' names began to take on a different weight. People spoke them carefully, as though saying them too loudly might invite something bad. Children were warned not to wander too far. Parents lingered longer when their kids were late coming home. The disappearance settled into local memory as an unfinished sentence. Not solved, not forgotten, just unanswered. And as the months passed, and then the years, the silence surrounding what happened on that mountain grew heavier, pressing down on the family and the investigators alike, leaving behind a case that refused to close and questions that would not stay buried. Time did not move forward cleanly after the searches ended. It dragged. The late 1980s arrived quietly, without answers, and settled over the family like a permanent fog. The house that had once felt crowded now felt hollow. Rooms holding on to objects that no longer had owners. Shoes by the door, jackets on hooks, things that could not be thrown away because throwing them away felt too close to giving up. The parents aged faster than anyone expected. Stress showed itself in small ways first. Sleepless nights, missed meals, medical appointments that had nothing to do with the disappearance, but were made worse by it. Every knock at the door still carried a moment of hope, even years later, followed by the familiar, crushing letdown. Birthdays became markers of absence. Cards were bought and never written in. Cakes were skipped altogether. Holidays lost their shape. The family learned how to talk around the sisters rather than about them, because saying their names out loud made the silence that followed too loud to bear. The brother stayed as long as he could. He helped his parents, took calls, drove out to the mountain more times than he could count. Eventually, he left town. Not because he stopped caring, but because staying had become unbearable. Every road led back to the same place. Every conversation ended the same way. Leaving felt like betrayal, but staying felt like suffocation. Law enforcement never closed the case. On paper, it remained active. In reality, it drifted. Files were moved from desks to cabinets. Detectives retired or transferred. New officers inherited old folders filled with reports that went nowhere. Every few years, someone took another look, hoping distance might reveal something proximity had missed. But there was nothing new to work with. No remains, no confirmed sightings, no physical evidence preserved in a way modern testing could use. Forensics in the late 1980s and early 1990s offered little for cases like this. Without a crime scene, there was no blood to analyze, no fibers to compare, no timeline to reconstruct. Occasionally, a tip would surface, a drifter passing through the region around the time of the disappearance, a hunter known to frequent the area alone. A man arrested years later for an unrelated violent crime, rumored to have been in eastern Kentucky in 1986. Each name brought a flicker of attention, followed by months of quiet verification. Investigators checked travel records when they existed. They conducted interviews when they could. Alibis were weak but not disprovable. Witnesses contradicted each other or no longer remembered clearly. Time eroded memories just as effectively as it erased physical traces. None of the leads held. Each one collapsed under scrutiny, leaving behind the same unanswered question. What happened to 3 women who vanished in the middle of the day and left nothing behind? In the community, the story shifted from shock to legend. People stopped asking what happened and started referring to the sisters as a single idea. The mountain girls, the ones who never came back. Parents used the story as a warning. Don't wander too far. Don't go alone. Don't assume the woods are safe just because you've walked them before. The mountain itself became a character in the telling. It was blamed for confusion, for accidents, for swallowing people whole. That explanation was easier to live with than the alternative. It suggested something impersonal, something that couldn't be helped. For the family, that explanation never fully settled. They returned to the area less often as years passed, but they never stopped thinking about it. Every new trail closure, every report of remains found somewhere else in the state, brought the same surge of anticipation. Maybe this time. Maybe now. Hope became something quieter, less like belief and more like habit. They kept a phone number current. They kept records. They answered questions when asked, even when the asking reopened wounds that had never fully healed. The 1990s brought changes to policing, to technology, to the way cold cases were discussed, but the sisters' disappearance stayed anchored in its original moment. It didn't benefit from new methods because there was nothing left to apply them to. It existed as a gap, a missing piece that no one could place. As the parents grew older, concerns shifted. Investigators worried privately about what would happen if they passed without answers. The case would lose its living anchors. It would become history rather than urgency. By the end of the decade, active efforts dwindled further. The file remained, but the energy was gone. It wasn't negligence. It was reality. Without new information, there was nowhere to go. The damage of that kind of uncertainty was cumulative. It didn't explode. It seeped. Relationships changed. Health declined. The family learned how to function alongside a question that would not resolve. Years later, people would say the case went cold. The truth was more complicated. It never froze completely. It simply sank, settling under layers of time and resignation, waiting. And somewhere, beneath the same ground that had refused to give answers in 1986, something remained untouched, unseen, holding on to the truth long after everyone else had been forced to let go. The discovery did not begin with a search for the sisters. It began with paperwork. Nearly 3 decades after the picnic, eastern Kentucky was still shaped by its coal history. Old property lines were being reviewed as part of a routine land survey tied to dormant mining claims. It was the kind of work that rarely intersected with human stories. Surveyors, walked steep wooded slopes, flagged boundaries, noted changes in terrain. Most days ended with nothing more than updated maps and sore legs. On one of those days, deep in a section of forest, miles from the original trailhead, something felt wrong. The ground along a narrow incline didn't match the surrounding soil. It wasn't dramatic. There was no obvious hole, no exposed bone, nothing that screamed danger. Just a subtle irregularity. Soil that appeared turned over long ago and then left to settle. Debris mixed in a way erosion alone didn't explain. At first, it was logged as an anomaly. Then it was revisited. A second look confirmed what the first had only suggested. This wasn't natural. The surveyors did what protocol required. They stopped work and notified local authorities. It wasn't framed as an emergency, just a concern. But when deputies arrived and walked the slope themselves, they understood why the call had been made. The area was isolated. No marked trails nearby. No reason for casual foot traffic. The disturbed section sat just far enough off any path to be invisible, unless someone knew where to look. Law enforcement secured the site. The tone shifted quietly but unmistakably. What had been a routine survey became something else entirely. A controlled excavation was authorized. It moved slowly, deliberately. Soil was removed in layers, each one documented. The process took hours, then days, and with each layer, the unease grew heavier. The first object recovered was small, unremarkable on its own, a piece of metal, corroded by time, then fabric, not intact, but recognizable. Weathered, compressed, preserved by the earth just enough to retain its shape. As the excavation continued, the outline of something human began to emerge. Forensic teams were brought in. The site was no longer treated as a potential accident or an abandoned dump location. It was treated as a grave. Personal items surfaced next. Jewelry, dulled but intact. Pieces that could be held in a gloved hand and immediately recognized for what they were. Not generic, not mass-produced in a way that erased identity. These were specific, chosen, worn. When investigators contacted surviving family members, the confirmations came quickly and painfully. The jewelry matched what the sisters had owned, what they were known to wear, what had been described in reports decades earlier. The remains were found close together. Too close. Positioned in a way that did not align with any natural disaster or accident scenario previously suggested. This was not a fall, not a gradual loss in the woods. This was placement. 3 individuals, 1 location, concealed intentionally. For the first time in nearly 30 years, the case shifted from speculation to certainty. The sisters had not disappeared. They had been taken there. The recovery process was meticulous. Bones were fragile. Time had done its work. But enough remained to establish identities, to confirm what the family had, feared, and hoped against for decades. Law enforcement treated the site with a gravity that reflected what it represented. This was no longer a missing persons file buried in cabinets. This was a homicide investigation reopening in real time. News spread quickly through the community. The mountain, long blamed for confusion and loss, was recast in a harsher light. It hadn't swallowed the sisters. It had hidden them. Investigators revisited old assumptions with new clarity. The distance from the picnic site mattered now. The location of the remains suggested transportation, planning, familiarity with the terrain. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive in the way accidents are. The spacing of the remains told its own story. There were no signs of struggle preserved in the soil, but the positioning suggested control, containment. Someone had decided where they would lie and made sure they stayed there. For the family, the call brought a complicated wave of emotion. Grief returned, sharper than before, but so did something else. Validation. After years of wondering if they had imagined the danger, if they had failed to protect their daughters from a simple mistake, the truth cut through the uncertainty. They had been right. Something terrible had happened. The confirmation was devastating, but it also ended the limbo. The question of where was answered, even if the question of who remained. For investigators, the discovery unlocked doors that had been closed for decades. The site became a focal point. Soil samples were taken. Tool marks were examined. Every fragment was catalogued. The absence of certain items was noted just as carefully as what was present. The mountain no longer felt infinite. It felt specific. Old reports were pulled from storage. Names that had once been penciled into margins were circled again. Timelines were redrawn. The reality of the burial reframed everything that came before it. This had not been an accident followed by poor search results. This had been concealment. And concealment implied intent. As the remains were transported for further examination, the weight of what had been uncovered settled over everyone involved. This was not closure. It was a beginning. A second chance at answers that had been denied for 3 decades. The forest returned to its quiet once the site was cleared, but it no longer held the same silence. Something had been taken from it, and with that removal came a responsibility. The sisters were no longer just missing. They were victims. And somewhere, whether alive or not, someone knew exactly how they ended up on that slope, watching from the distance of time, about to have the ground beneath them shift just as violently as it had for the family who had waited 30 years to finally hear the truth. The excavation gave investigators something they had never had before. Context. For nearly 30 years, the case had existed as a question without edges. Now it had a location, a pattern, and physical evidence that could be studied with tools that did not exist in 1986. The remains were examined carefully, respectfully, with an understanding of how much time had passed. Not everything could be determined. Soft tissue was gone. Certain answers would never be recovered. But enough remained to begin reconstructing what had happened after the sisters left the trailhead. Cause of death could not be pinpointed with absolute certainty, but the findings ruled out the explanations that had lingered for decades. There was no evidence consistent with a fall down a ravine, no indication of exposure as the primary factor. The way the bodies were positioned, the way they were grouped, spoke louder than any single injury ever could. They had not died where they were found, by chance. They had been placed. Soil analysis told part of the story. Layers showed deliberate disturbance at a single point in time, not gradual erosion or animal activity. The depth was consistent across the site, suggesting the use of tools rather than bare hands. Marks in the surrounding earth indicated digging that had been concealed quickly, not carefully landscaped, just enough to hide what was underneath. This was not the work of someone panicking after an accident. It was the work of someone who understood the area well enough to believe it would never be discovered. Investigators began rebuilding the timeline, working backward from the burial site to the day of the picnic. The distance mattered. It meant transportation. It meant control. It meant the sisters did not wander there on their own. The case files from the 1980s were reopened and digitized. Old tips were read again, this time without the assumption that the mountain was responsible. Statements that once seemed irrelevant were reevaluated with fresh eyes. Patterns emerged slowly, then unmistakably. One name appeared more often than investigators remembered, not because it had been prominent, but because it had been easy to dismiss. A local man who lived within driving distance of both the trailhead and the burial site. Someone familiar with old mining roads and unmarked paths. Someone who had worked around coal land long enough to know which areas were avoided and which were forgotten. In 1986, he had been in his early 40s, known to some as a quiet presence, known to others as volatile. His record included violence, though not the kind that had triggered serious prison time. Fights, threats, incidents that stayed just below the threshold of lasting consequence. He had been questioned briefly during the initial investigation. He denied seeing the sisters, denied being near the trailhead that day. There was nothing to contradict him at the time. No evidence, no witnesses willing to go on record. He slipped back into the background easily. Now, decades later, investigators noticed something that hadn't stood out before: his access to land connected to abandoned mining property, his familiarity with the exact section of forest where the remains were found, his presence in the area that summer, documented casually by people who hadn't thought it mattered. Witness statements from the past began to align in ways they never had before. A report of a vehicle near the trailhead that didn't belong to the sisters. The description had been vague, but it matched what the man was known to drive at the time. A recollection of an argument overheard weeks before the disappearance, dismissed as unrelated. The timing now felt different. There was also the statement that had always bothered one retired investigator. A comment made years after the disappearance by a man who had been drinking heavily at the time. He'd claimed to know what happened to the mountain girls. He'd laughed afterward, said he was joking. The statement had been written off as cruel talk fueled by alcohol. That man had been the same one. At the time, there had been no bodies, no proof, nothing to justify pressing harder. Now, with the burial site established, that comment carried new weight. Investigators tracked him down. He was old now, his body thinner, his movements slower. The confidence that once made him dismissive had faded into something closer to irritation. He agreed to speak with law enforcement, perhaps believing that time had insulated him from consequences. The interviews were careful, not aggressive, not rushed. They asked him about his routine in 1986, about his work, about the trails, about the land. He answered easily at first, relying on memory gaps and the assumption that no one could prove otherwise. But memory is uneven. Small details slipped through. He placed himself closer to the area than he had in earlier statements. He contradicted things he'd once been certain about. When confronted gently with discrepancies, he grew defensive, then dismissive, then tired. Psychological pressure doesn't always come from force. Sometimes it comes from time, from realizing that the version of events you've told yourself for decades is no longer holding. Investigators showed him maps. They didn't accuse. They let silence do the work. They watched as his eyes lingered on certain areas longer than others. Watched how his breathing changed when the burial site was mentioned. He denied knowing the sisters, then admitted he'd seen them before. He denied being near the trailhead, then admitted he might have driven by. Each shift was small, but together they formed a pattern. They didn't need a full confession to see where this was going. The evidence had already begun to close in around him. For the family, updates came slowly. They were told only what they needed to know, enough to prepare them for the direction the case was taking, enough to understand that answers were coming, even if those answers would hurt. As investigators built their case, they reconstructed a likely sequence of events. The sisters encountered someone familiar enough not to raise immediate alarm, someone who offered help, or conversation, or access to something just off the trail. The decision to follow would have felt small at the time, a moment that couldn't be undone. What happened after was quick, controlled. The absence of scattered belongings supported that. There was no chaotic struggle across the forest. Whatever occurred happened in a confined space, away from public view. The transport to the burial site required effort, planning, and knowledge. This was not a spontaneous act. It was one that relied on confidence that the mountain would protect the secret. As the case tightened, the man's health declined. Interviews became shorter. Lawyers entered the picture. But the pressure did not ease. It intensified. The community began to feel the shift. Rumors surfaced again, this time with sharper edges. People who had known the man quietly reconsidered old interactions. Things that once seemed odd now felt significant. Investigators prepared for the final steps: warrants, charges, the possibility that justice would arrive decades late, but arrive nonetheless. And as the man sat with the weight of what was closing in around him, it became clear that the mountain had not erased the past. It had preserved it, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer stay buried, and when the final piece of the story would demand to be told. By the time investigators reached the final phase of the case, the story no longer felt distant or abstract. It felt close, personal, heavy with inevitability. The mountain that had once absorbed speculation now stood as a fixed point in a reconstructed timeline that finally made sense. The clue that revealed everything was not a single object or sentence. It was alignment. Pieces that had never fit before now sat flush against one another, forming a shape that could no longer be ignored. Investigators concluded that the sisters' disappearance began with familiarity, not force. They encountered someone they recognized, if only casually. A face they had seen before. A name that didn't trigger alarm. In a small community, that kind of recognition carried weight. It softened edges, lowered defenses. The interaction likely felt harmless at first. A conversation near the trailhead, a shared comment about the heat, an offer of something just off the path. The reason mattered less than the trust it created in that moment. Whatever the invitation was, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt ordinary. That decision, to step off the trail, was the last choice they made freely. What followed unfolded quickly. Investigators believed the sisters were led to a secluded area, shielded from view and sound. The absence of scattered belongings suggested control from the beginning. There was no prolonged chase through the woods, no evidence of panic across the landscape. The encounter was contained. The offender knew the terrain. He knew where people didn't go. He knew how sound traveled, and more importantly, how it didn't. The mountain didn't witness what happened next. It absorbed it. The exact cause of death would never be fully known, but the evidence supported a violent outcome that occurred in close succession. There was no indication of separation, no signs that one sister escaped or survived longer than the others. The grouping of the remains told that story clearly. Afterward came the part that defined the crime as intentional and calculated. The transport, the burial, the choice of a location tied to abandoned mining land, far from casual hikers, far from search grids. This wasn't improvisation. It was knowledge applied under pressure. Investigators believed the offender returned to the site at least once. Soil patterns suggested adjustments, not to improve concealment, but to check, to reassure himself that the secret remained intact. For decades, it did. When the evidence was finally laid out, the case no longer relied on imagination or theory. It rested on convergence, physical findings, re-examined witness statements, behavioral patterns that matched known histories of violence and control. The suspect was confronted with the totality of it late in his life. He had outlived the fear of being caught, or so he believed, but time had eroded his certainty. Memory failed him in ways that made deception harder. The past, once buried, resurfaced relentlessly. Accounts differ on how much he admitted. Some investigators described a partial confession, delivered in fragments, weighted down by deflection and minimization. Others described silence that spoke just as clearly. What mattered legally was that the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Charges were prepared. Before a trial could take place, the suspect's health deteriorated rapidly. Hospitalizations interrupted interviews. Court proceedings slowed. Eventually, he died, taking with him any chance of a full public confession, delivered in his own words. For some, that felt like a final injustice. For others, it didn't change the outcome. The case was closed based on evidence, not testimony. The conclusion stood, regardless of whether the offender lived to hear it spoken in a courtroom. Law enforcement held a press conference. The tone was measured. No dramatic language, just facts, delivered carefully. The sister's disappearance was officially ruled a homicide. A suspect was named. The findings were summarized. The questions that had lingered for 30 years were addressed directly. The mountain was cleared of blame. For the family, the announcement landed with a weight they had been carrying for most of their lives. It did not bring relief, it brought reality. The kind that settles deep and changes how grief is held. Funerals were planned for the first time. Not memorials, not vigils. Funerals. Dates were chosen. Caskets were ordered. Decisions that had been impossible for decades were suddenly unavoidable. Friends and extended family gathered again, older now, quieter. The sisters were spoken of not as mysteries, but as people. Their lives were remembered without speculation attached. Stories were told that had nothing to do with the mountain. Their names were no longer shorthand for disappearance. They were restored to individuality. The burial of their remains marked an end that should have come long ago. There was no sense of victory, no triumph, just a solemn acknowledgement of what had been taken and what had finally been returned. In the weeks that followed, the community adjusted to the truth. The story lost its rumors and gained clarity. Parents stopped warning children with half-remembered myths and started telling them what actually happened. The caution remained, but it was grounded now, anchored in reality. The mountain itself did not change. It remained as it always had. Trees growing, trails winding, seasons cycling through. But its role in the story shifted permanently. It was no longer the keeper of a secret. It was simply the place where one had been hidden. Closure, as the family came to understand it, was not an erasure of pain. It was permission. Permission to stop imagining every possible ending. Permission to grieve what had been lost without holding space for hope that could never be fulfilled. They didn't forgive. They didn't forget. They accepted. 30 years after 3 sisters left for a picnic and never came home, the truth finally stood still long enough to be seen clearly. Not dramatic, not poetic, just real. And in that reality, the story reached its end, not with answers that healed everything, but with answers that allowed the living to move forward, carrying grief that was finally named, finally placed, and no longer lost somewhere on the mountain.